Hello everyone and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. In the last video, we were back in time with John's sister Julia and her memories of her much-loved brother John Lennon. So I'm going through her book like a detective to see what we can learn that may not be known. In the last episode, I was shocked about her secret regarding Aunt Mimi. And I'm excited to see what else we can learn about John from the viewpoint of his sister. So Julia, she never knew about her sister Mimi and her secret romance. She was having fun spending time with John. And John got to practice his music with the band he created called the Quarrymen. And the band practiced at Julia's house, and they were starting to get bookings, which must have been exciting. John's sister said that their first public performance was at Lees Park Golf Club on the outskirts of Liverpool. And the drummer Colin Hatton also remembered playing St. Peter's Church Youth Club in Moulton Village. The place was small, but they complained that they had no microphone and they wanted to be considered professional. The place wasn't paying them and they threw them out. So then Colin also remembered they played the Vespa Scooter Club, and Mother Julia went and sat at the front of the stage. He said that there was hardly anybody there, and Julia clapped loudly at the end of every song. I bet she was filled with pride at her son, and I'm glad she got to see his music beginnings. Julia, as John knew, was his greatest supporter. So how did they get to their shows? Well, they used the bus like all the other groups did in Liverpool, and they were on a double-decker bus, and they put their instruments on the cubbyhole meant for strollers and parcels, and then they went up to the top of the bus to smoke and plan. And a new club opened up in Liverpool in January 1957. It was called the Cavern Club. The Quarrymen first played there in early 1957, and they were entering competitions at the time, and the rules were they had to attend a preliminary round on a Sunday in order to get through the next round with a real audience the following Wednesday. The Quarrymen were given 5 minutes to show their talent, but they lost to another skiffle group. Once they got more gigs, they talked about what they should wear on stage. John's sister said that the first outfits were from Julia. So Julia was at a market in town where they sold all sorts of things at an auction. So they had cowboy shirts from America, and Julia bought 3 of them, and John loved it. Paul was introduced to John by their friend Ivan Vaughn at the church fete. John was 16 and Paul 15. They got together and they played music, and John was impressed by Paul's guitar playing, and he knew the words to a lot of songs. And John, he didn't really know lyrics to half the songs, and he made up his own words. Paul looked up to John. He was impressed that John had read the entire works of Winston Churchill, and John had his own band, and John was allowed to dress like a Ted, and Paul was hoping he could too. So John looked at Paul, and he saw that he was more sociable than he was, and he felt that Paul might try to become the band leader if he let him join. He put his fears aside and had a friend ask Paul if he wanted to join, and Paul said yes. And the Quarrymen lineup at that time was John was the singer and he played the guitar, Paul was a singer and he played guitar, Colin was on drums, and Lynn and Ivan were on T-chest bass, and Nigel was the group's manager. Around this time, Pete Shotton was John's best friend, and he played the washboard, and it was at this time that Pete and John decided that he should leave the band. The end came one night when the band was playing at Colin's aunt's party. They were having free beers, and John and Pete were talking, and they both had too much to drink, and by the end of the night, John had broke Pete's washboard over his head. It was done as a joke, and that was the end of Pete's being in the group. And the first time Paul was to play with the Quarrymen on August the 7th, 1957, he didn't make it because he had a prior engagement at a scout camp in North Wales. Well, at this time, John was 16 and he needed money because he smoked and he wanted to drink and he needed money for the band. And Bobby Dykins got him a job with basic pay at the restaurant where he worked, and he would wash dishes and wait tables. And Dykins at that time was the restaurant manager there. John was going to school, but he missed school to spend time with Julia, and Julia supported John in his music career, and he spent time practicing and getting better instruments. He learned more chords and words to songs so that they could play more songs. John was at school, and he would pass around notes and draw cartoons, and he was the joker of the classroom. Somehow, even though he had no O-levels on his exams, he was accepted to Liverpool College of Art. This didn't happen by accident. Aunt Mimi helped him, and so did his headmaster. And there was also a great portfolio that allowed what was on John's mind to be shown, and he did that with the help of Julia. John was told by Aunt Mimi that he needed to attend his classes more frequently than he had done at the school if he wanted to be more successful, and he said he would. Paul's first performance was October the 18th at New Clubmore Hall. It was a conservative club in the North Green district of Liverpool. John and Paul had on white jackets. And Paul, he messed up on the first song, Guitar Boogie, because he was nervous. John encouraged him, saying he was the new boy and he would improve with time. So even though he had stage fright, Paul had something, according to John's sister. He was young, but Paul was a better guitar player than John or Eric. John thought that Paul looked a little bit like Elvis. John realized he would have to step up his game and learn guitar chords instead of banjo chords. Paul entering the band was a great step for the band. So the year 1957, the group would play a lot of small venues, and some of them invited them back and others didn't. And Paul added to their material, and John would do Elvis numbers like Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes, and Paul did Long Tall Sally, a Little Richard song. And they would enter free talent contest. If they won the money, which wasn't too much, they would share the win, and they drank most of it away. They wanted to look like tough teddy boys, but if they saw a real one, according to Sister Julia, they would run a mile. Julia had taught songs to John like Wedding Bells, Breaking Up That Old Gang of Mine, Ramona, A Girl of My Dreams, I Love You, Honest I Do, and Little White Lies. And Paul brought in songs that he knew. Then Paul and John started to write their own songs, and they found a mutual inspiration, and then they would write down the idea in notebooks when they weren't together, and then when they got together later, they would go over them. So Julia's house was where the band would practice. They would go in the kitchen, and when Julia heard that Paul's mother had died of breast cancer, she would ask John to bring Paul home and have something to eat, saying, that poor boy, he lost his mother. Paul brought George Harrison around one day to become a prospective band member. He was only a few months younger than Paul. He was 14, and John wouldn't have considered him, but his guitar playing was great. So George had seen the Quarrymen play one time, and he was a big fan of the group, and he admired John. So I mentioned earlier that Pete Shotton had decided to leave the group. He wasn't a musician, and he thought the washboard was an easy instrument. And then Pete told John that night that it was fun, but being in a band wasn't for him. So Pete wasn't worried about John getting close to Paul. He could see that Paul was good for the band, and Mimi had a social snobbery, and she liked Pete, but she thought Paul was common because he lived in a console house. And in time, Mimi, though, she started to like Paul and approve of his friendship with John. Pete and John remained great friends for years. In February of 1958, Len Gary, who played the T-chest bass, had to leave the group because of meningitis. He was in the hospital for months. And then Nigel Wally got tuberculosis and had to go to a sanitarium for 6 months. In August, Eric left the group because he couldn't afford the new electric guitar the rest of the group wanted, and George Harrison replaced him. And John Loeb joined them occasionally playing the piano. Now the group consisted of 3 guitarists and a drummer, and then there was no room for a banjo or accordion. So this is the sad part of the video when they talk about the death of Julia. John's sister remembered that John had come to the house, and he told his sister that Mummy wouldn't be long. He had seen her at Mendip. So John got something to eat, and he and Dykins were watching TV. Dykins put his daughters Julia and Jackie to bed and told them that Mummy would come up when she got back, and he told them they could read in bed, and school was tomorrow. They fell asleep, and they were awakened by voices downstairs. Julia and Jackie sat on the stairs huddling with each other, and the police had come to the house. And then they went back to bed and got under the covers. They were too scared to go down. Nana came to see them and climbed in bed with them and said that Mummy had been in an accident. It was in the hospital, and their father was crying in the next room. Nana would go between seeing Dykins to seeing Julia and Jackie. So John's sister knew something was wrong because Nana didn't normally hug them in bed, and her father was so upset. So Julia and Jackie went to school the next day, but later the headmaster took them to his office. Teachers were coming in and hugging them, and the sisters began to cry and didn't know why. All the headmaster would say was that what they already knew, that their mummy had been in an accident and she was in the hospital. So then they were taken home, and Julia's sister was there with Bert. And Julia and Jackie asked, "What's the matter?" And then they were told by Mater that you girls are coming up to Scotland for a holiday. They told them that Mummy was very ill and you won't be allowed to visit her yet. And then they were taken out of the home for the last time, and they didn't know that at the time. Michael Fishwick, the guy that was seeing Aunt Mimi on the side, recalled that Julia arrived in the afternoon for a visit, and John was there with some of his friends, and later John decided to go for a walk and later go to Julia's house at Springwood. John's friends then left, and it was just Julia, Mimi, and Michael. Julia remembered that she had to get home so that Bobby could go to work. Mimi walked her to the front gate and then went back into the house. Michael said that he and Mimi were talking when they both heard a screech of tires and a bang. They didn't say anything, they just looked at each other and then ran out of the house and across the road. Julia was lying on her back, just on the pavement. Michael said that she looked peaceful and didn't look like she had an injury. He felt that she was either unconscious or in a coma. When he looked closer, he saw a small pool of blood at the back of her head, and it was hidden by her red hair. A small group of onlookers were standing back, and someone said that an ambulance had been called, and just before the ambulance came, Julia gave a loud gasp, and then Michael believes that was the time of her death. Mimi went in with Julia in the ambulance, and Michael stayed in the waiting room for hours while Mimi was with Julia. They were traumatized when they left the hospital, and they took a taxi ride home. When they went to Julia's house, there was a group of people there that were friends and neighbors. Norm and a brother-in-law of Mimi's took Michael home. And when he woke up that morning, John and Mimi weren't there, so he left a note on the breakfast room table. He didn't see Mimi again until October. So then, according to John Lennon, he remembered feeling bitter inside losing his mother. They had just started to have a great relationship, and then he felt like that he had no real responsibilities to anyone after she died. So Bobby and John went to the hospital in a taxi, and John remembered he was nervously talking to the taxi driver. And when they got to the hospital, John couldn't bear to see his mother, and when Bobby went in to look at her, he broke down in John's arms in the lobby. John said he couldn't seem to cry, not then anyway. He felt frozen inside. So I'm going to end the video on this tragic note, and next we'll see how John and his sisters reacted to Julia's death, and how they were separated from each other due to Aunt Mimi not wanting to take care of Julia's illegitimate children. So it was interesting to see how John's love of music continued to grow, and how Julia helped John to proceed in his dream of being in a band. She loved watching him on stage and was his #1 fan. As I mentioned earlier, I'm glad she got to see him play in a band, and I wish she had lived long enough to see him in the Beatles with all his success. She would have loved all that. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everyone a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.